and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, Myanmar's leader Aung San Suu Kyi arrives in Beijing to step up bilateral ties and discuss the fate of a controversial China-backed dam project on her first visit to China since taking office. So what lies ahead between the two countries? And the U.S. transfers 15 Guantanamo Bay prisoners to UAE in the largest single release of detainees under Obama, who had vowed to close the detention center upon taking office. Can the president fulfill his promise? And we begin today's show with China-Myanmar relations. Myanmar State Councilor Aung San Suu Kyi arrives in Beijing on Wednesday for an official visit at the invitation of Premier Li Keqiang. The 5-day trip makes her the first leader from Myanmar to visit China since the new government was formed in late March. With Myanmar's ongoing political transformation, what lies ahead for the relations between China and Myanmar? We will discuss that and many other issues related to the two countries. But first, take a look at this.
Reaching out. This isn't the first time that Aung San Suu Kyi has visited China. In June last year, she led a delegation to Beijing and met with China's President Xi Jinping. The trip marked a warming of relations between China and Myanmar. Earlier this year, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi also visited Myanmar and met with Aung San Suu Kyi.
China is pleased to stand by Myanmar and continue to be a good neighbor, a good friend, and a good partner.
Myanmar falls within the framework of China's One Belt, One Road initiative. The Bangladesh-China-India-Myanmar Economic Corridor project is another Chinese initiative likely to benefit the country. And Myanmar is also eyeing the AIIB for more infrastructure cooperation. Last year, Aung San Suu Kyi led the NLD to a majority win in Myanmar's first openly contested election in 25 years. This has turned the page for the country, but many challenges still lie ahead. Topping the list is its internal peace process negotiations, also a key issue for Suu Kyi during her China trip. Last October, 8 armed rebel groups signed a national ceasefire agreement, while many others refused. But more of these groups are edging closer to joining in a peace conference that will run from the last day of August for 5 days. Myanmar has also invited its biggest neighbour China to participate as a key observer. With Myanmar in a state of transition, maintaining good working relations through the journey could be a challenge for both nations, and no doubt Aung San Suu Kyi's visit is a good start.
And for more on Aung San Suu Kyi's visit to China, we are joined here in Beijing studio, Mr. Yang Xiyu, who's a senior fellow from the China Institute of International Studies. And also from Washington, D.C., we have Priscilla Clapp, who is a former chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Myanmar. Also in Singapore, we're having Lim Tan Wai, adjunct research fellow at the East Asia Institute in the National University of Singapore, also a senior lecturer at SIM University over there. Welcome to the three of you. First of all, I want to begin by asking you, Mr. Yang, first official visit to China after she comes into the role of state councilor and the foreign minister. After the new government was being formed, 5 days. That's quite long.
Yep.
The first country she visits besides those ASEAN countries.
Yep.
So what does all of these mean together, the significance of this trip?
Well, both symbolic and substantive. Symbolically, she wants to send a signal that the new government of Myanmar pay special attention, pay very great strategic importance to relationship with China. Although there have been some speculations or rumors about troubled bilateral relations, her first visit make a very clear signal. That's wrong. The true intention, true signal is the stability and the continuity of the development of the bilateral relation. By his visit, the trend will be strengthened.
Continuity, you're referring to very briefly, Mr. Yang,
Yep.
before she came into office, during the junta time?
Yes, clearly, both Myanmar and China want to maintain the stability based on the long course of the bilateral relationship, based on the long course of the policies from both sides.
I
so
see.
that relates to the continuity, say, for both China or Myanmar side. They need to continue the previous policies.
Ms. Clapp, what about that? Is that possible, particularly at the time when you see if Ms. Suu Kyi wants to do that, she really needs to exercise a high degree of pragmatism in the diplomacy?
Yes, I think we will see a high degree of pragmatism. But she is, during the years of military governance, particularly the last 10 years, foreign relations with the great powers, Myanmar's foreign relations with the great powers became skewed because of Western dissatisfaction with the military government. And I think Aung San Suu Kyi's main mission is to rebalance the country's relations with great powers so that they have equal weight. So there will be equal weight between China and the West and Russia and Japan and all the other powers, centers of power in the world. And I think that means continuity for its relations with China. It is not discontinuity, but it means a rebalancing of Myanmar's relations with the rest of the world. And we will see that playing out very soon, because she's going from China to the United States, to the UN, to Canada, and so forth.
Yeah, we'll see how it's going to unveil her thoughts on the country's diplomacy. Having said that, though, Mr. Lim, coming from Singapore, of course, one of the important points of diplomacy for Ms. Suu Kyi is also Myanmar's relations with the ASEAN countries. Some were suggesting Myanmar could be a game changer. Others were saying, well, may not necessarily be. What is your opinion, given her first trip to China already?
Yes, this is a very significant visit, because it has been mentioned in the international media that this is a visit to a major power, and the previous guest has also mentioned this is also a visit that commensurates with the Myanmarese government's attempt to be able to be friendly to all major powers in the world. And before visiting China, Ms. Aung San Suu Kyi has also visited Southeast Asian countries like Thailand. So this is really a sort of attempt to reach out to the important neighbors of Myanmar, and also to reach out to the major powers in the region. And China is one of these important neighboring major powers to Myanmar.
Yes, indeed. We have been talking about this trip for quite some time, because since her last trip to China, which was before the election, it was in the month of June, right before, 5 months before the November election, she came over here and certainly had some good discussions with the Chinese leaders. Eventually, her party won the election and she became the state councilor. But this time, of course, she's coming in with much bigger capacity.
Yep.
She is thinking about streamlining the whole national policy, whether it's diplomacy or economic development. Mr. Yang, 2 points. One, it seems that Mr. Suu Kyi is going to ask help and support from China about domestic peace process.
Yep.
Secondly, she's also likely to discuss with China about the future of her grand economic plan, even though some argue it is quite bland. Whether grand or bland, that certainly needs some kinds of investment coming from all of the region. Mr. Yang, how much do you think she will be satisfied, quote unquote, this time?
Well, actually, you are touching on both of the fundamental challenges facing the new government. And she really wants to get help from China on both of the issues. But compared with the peaceful process, China can play bigger roles in the economic front rather than the peace process.
Let's talk about peace process, if it is difficult.
Yeah.
So let's put on the difficult point first. There has been a lot of talk about China's possible influence on one of those armed ethnic groups directed by the ethnic Chinese called Kang, but it's only ethnic Chinese. It's someone in Myanmar, and suggesting the border issue could also be one between China and Myanmar. How much China would have a say on this issue, given its domestic affairs of Myanmar, and also We saw the 21st century so-called Pangdong meeting is coming over at the end of this month. How much can be achieved during Mr. Suu Kyi's visit?
To some degree, China is in dilemma. That's why I said it's a very difficult issue for China.
What
because
do you mean dilemma?
China has insisted on the long-time Islam non-provisional principle. So basically, the peace process in Myanmar is a domestic issue in Myanmar. However, it really relates to a lot of ethnic Chinese in Myanmar. So we are in a dilemma. However, China can play a positive role as a facilitator or informal mediator among groups. But I think that is most. I think the keys lies in the confrontational groups rather than lies in China. What China can do is just create a peaceful environment, create a good political atmosphere to facilitate for talks. So we don't intervene. We don't want to intervene the internal affairs. However, we will strongly oppose any efforts for military solution.
All right.
So that's, I think, China's position.
Ms. Clapp, it is no secret that China has been very vocal about supporting the peace process going on in Myanmar over the past few months. Also, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi, last time during his visit there, he said it very clearly once and again. Having said that, though, how much do you think Ms. Suu Kyi this time as State Councilor will be able to help Myanmar bringing on a peace process among all its ethnic groups? Once again, we look at the calendar. August the 31st, that will be the so-called the 21st century Panglong meeting, which is supposed to be all the armed ethnic groups in Myanmar come together. Will that be solved during this part of her China trip?
No, the peace process is going to be a very, very long process. And the Panglong conference later this month will just be the beginning of a new phase in that conference, in that process. The last government, the Thein Sein government, concentrated on the ceasefire agreement. With Panglong, we're going to see the process move into a much wider group, including not only the armed groups, including the Tatmadaw, the National Army, and the ethnic armed groups, but also political leaders, and there'll be some civil society there. It will be a very large conference, and it will begin to deal with some fundamental political and other issues that have been plaguing relations between the ethnic groups and the majority. I think China plays a very important role here because several of the major armed groups are right there on the border and relate to China very directly because there are similar groups in China. And China has very strong influence on these groups. And so the fact that the Hua and the Mola and so forth have agreed to go to Panglong is really a plus for China. China will get credit for having encouraged them in that direction. And I think she'll probably be grateful for that.
All right, Mr. Yang, I want to come back to you very briefly from you as well. We have seen some issues between China and Myanmar. For example, a few months ago, one Myanmar airplane from the Air Force mistakenly bombed a sugar field over the border of China, and of course killed several individuals over there. But certainly that was a mistake, and the two sides have already come to an agreement in a way about the nature of it. And you also see that the Myanmar government has come to realize that the interactions between the Chinese side and those from the Myanmar side, when it comes to the ethnic groups, are mainly individual interactions rather than governmental and over-border approaches. So what do you make of these mixed signals and events between China and Myanmar, considering security, considering domestic peace process?
Well, it's a really mixed challenges. On one hand, China has to help Myanmar to solve the military confrontations between the local forces and the governments. But on the other hand, China really have serious concerns about the security both for our own and the ethnic Chinese over there.
Yeah.
That's why I said we strongly oppose any kind of a military solution. And we will try every effort to facilitate all the groups to get together through the peaceful process.
And certainly it is not just politics, it is also economy. As we say, that one of the most important thing on Ms. Suu Kyi's agenda, one of Ms. Suu Kyi's focus of the visit is bilateral trade between China and Myanmar. China, the largest source of foreign investment for Myanmar over the years. Up to July this year, Chinese investment in Myanmar has reached beyond the $25 billion US, taking up about 40% of the total foreign investment in the country. China is also the largest trading partner of Myanmar, making up 1/3 of Myanmar's total trade volume. And those are just some of the numbers when it comes to trade and economic development between the two countries. The question is, Ms. Clapp, before I go to Mr. Lim, let me ask you once again, how much will Ms. Suu Kyi be able to achieve her goals of having more Chinese investment in Myanmar? We still got some issues about the copper mines, we still got some issues about the dam project.
Yes, there are many issues, but there are many issues because China is such a big investor in Myanmar. There's no question that there is a future, for a large future, for Chinese investment in Myanmar. The challenge for China is going to be to make that investment work for the people of Myanmar and not just for China. Right now, the perception in Myanmar among the people is that Chinese investment is for China's benefit and not their benefit. So China's challenge is going to be working with Aung San Suu Kyi's government to make sure that their projects meet the needs of the people.
All right. And Mr. Lim, what do you make of it? Because when you look at the ASEAN economies, including that of Myanmar, bilateral trade has been a very active factor in the relations. But still, it's not necessarily going to mean everything is going to be peaceful and wonderful. There are always issues that have to be worked on. And Mr. Lim, what do you make of it, the possibilities?
There appears to be 3 items on the agenda. The first item is the Asian Development Bank has identified the need for US $60 billion worth of loans and aids that's needed to modernize Myanmar's electricity supply. And so China can possibly play a role in this. Second item that is mentioned is the fact about infrastructure, particularly transportation infrastructure. And China also can play a role in this, particularly since China is pushing the One Belt, One Road and the AIIB infrastructure bank. And so these 2 avenues offer possibilities for both China and Myanmar to talk and come to a certain win-win situation based on their national needs and priorities. So they need, this would be a very good opportunity for the 2 leaders to come together to talk. And as the previous guest has mentioned, when the talk goes on, it is important for both sides to assess how China can help the local communities that are situated along these highway routes, as well as the third item, which is hydropower dam project, how China can help and benefit the local communities, and how the Myanmarese government can maximize benefits for local communities based on their priorities.
Right.
So it is, as you have mentioned earlier on, China is a major trader and an investor, and therefore there's a much potential for possibilities for cooperation.
Mr. Yang, having said that though, China and Myanmar both have realized, and they said it openly as well to the international community, that the deals have to be mutually beneficial and it has to be win-win. That's the basic line of doing trade anyway. So on the one hand, China could contribute. On the other hand, how is the Chinese government going to guarantee the rights and also the social responsibilities of enterprises, of the business community?
Yeah, I think it's a really big questions for Chinese investors and Chinese enterprises because of past several failed cases or bad stories. So I think by this summit or visit, the top-level visit, both sides will touch on this very concrete issue because that is issue relating to the investors' confidence,
That's right.
the status of the commercial activities
These
in
have
Myanmar.
become samples
Yeah.
as to which direction the bilateral trade cooperation is going.
Yeah, so that's not an issue relating to individual projects. It's an issue of the total environment, total atmosphere, total conditions for business, for doing business in Myanmar. And the Myanmar government really desperately need the foreign investors and foreign commercials flood in. But without a solution or good solution to the confidence, to the atmosphere, they cannot achieve what they want.
One of the things, Mr. Yang, I really want you to shed some light very briefly on this. Politics in Myanmar has changed from before the election to after the election.
Yeah.
And of course, Ms. Suu Kyi and her party goal, it has also switched from winning in the election to governing a country and making sure there's plan, there's also ways to implement the plans for the country's future. So how much will that, in a way, impact on the ways of thinking when it comes to business with China? And how much of that will, in a way, make the two countries thinking about the fundamentals when it comes to economic and trade development?
For China's perspective, ideally, the changes is inevitable in Myanmar, but the changes should be focused in their political structure. But the economic atmosphere, the business atmosphere should be maintained, even improved. That's what we hope. And through the political reforms and economic reconstruction, I think the environment for investment will be better. We hope.
We'll see. And before we go, I want one sentence from the other two panelists each. What is your expectations for this trip, and how is that likely to impact your country's relations with Myanmar? Ms. Clapp, shall we go with you first, very briefly?
Okay, I think this will be a very important visit because it will be her first visit where she is responsible basically for the government. So it will be the beginning of the relationship between Myanmar and China for this administration in Myanmar. As far as the U.S. is concerned, we certainly expect her to be visiting China before she makes visits elsewhere in the world, because China is her largest neighbor.
All right, I see.
And it's perfectly fine with the United States.
And Mr. Lim, what do you think? Briefly from you.
This visit is very important because it can set the tone for lower level visits by bureaucrats and politicians on both sides. It can also set the overall tone for the bilateral relations for decades to come. And many in ASEAN countries are expecting or have certain hopes that relationships can be stable and peaceful, and that cooperative trade deals as well as infrastructure building can persist and sustain.
Lin Tan Wei from Singapore, Priscilla Clapp from the United States, and Yang Xiyu here in China. Thank you so much for joining us and shedding some light on the prospect of this visit. Thank you, really appreciate it. Stay with us here on World Inside. We got our final segment coming right up. 15 prisoners are transferred to the UAE in the Obama administration's largest single release of detainees from Guantanamo Bay, which the president had vowed to close before he leaves office. Could time be running out? You're watching World Inside on CCTV News, coming to you live from Beijing. The United States says it has transferred 15 Guantanamo Bay prisoners to the United Arab Emirates. 12 Yemenis and 3 Afghans were moved, bringing the number of prisoners in Guantanamo down to 61. Most have been held without trial or charge for more than a decade, about 12 years. This is the single largest transfer of Guantanamo detainees under Obama, who has launched a new plan to shut down the facility in February. Will Guantanamo Bay finally close? Before we go to our discussion, let's take a look at this.
All 15 detainees transferred from the U.S. military facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, were allegedly linked to al-Qaeda or other terrorist groups. 2 were suspected of being bodyguards for Osama bin Laden. They were transferred to the United Arab Emirates, where they will be held until they're deemed safe to release.
The detainees have been vetted through what is a very rigorous process, and I can assure you that it's a very rigorous process.
A lawyer for one of the detainees praised the transfer.
The new life will entail not being in a prison, but being under fairly restrictive limitations to begin with. But I hope that at some point his family will be able to come see him from Yemen, and I hope then he'll be able to get on and get a job, and what he really wants to do is be married and have a family.
Guantanamo Bay has been a focus of international outrage for years. U.S. President Barack Obama has vowed to close the facility, but the U.S. Congress has barred the transfer of detainees onto U.S. soil. Critics of the Republican Party say it's reckless to release the prisoners and create a situation where those detainees could launch attacks against the U.S. or its allies. A small number of detainees released in the past have gone on to conduct terrorist attacks, but the U.S. says the risk is minimal.
Various countries and governments who have accepted them have worked very hard to maintain surveillance of these individuals, keep track of them, keep an eye on them, if you will, to ensure that they no longer pose a security threat to anyone, not just the American people, but to anyone.
Attempts to try detainees have dragged on for years. Some prisoners, like accused 9/11 planner Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, were subjected to torture, what the U.S. calls enhanced interrogation techniques. That means much of what he has said would likely not be admissible in a trial. American authorities have also been wary of discussing classified information in open court. The 61 prisoners still at Guantanamo Bay remain in legal limbo. It's unclear what will happen to Guantanamo Bay after the upcoming U.S. presidential election. The Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton has vowed to close the facility, but she'll face all the same legal and political obstacles as President Obama. The Republican nominee Donald Trump says he will not only keep the facility open, he's vowed to expand it. Jim Spellman, CCTV, Washington.
And for more discussion about the prisoner transfer from Guantanamo Bay to the United Arab Emirates, we are joined in Boston, the United States, Jim Walsh, professor at the Security Studies program of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And also in Tel Aviv, we are having Mr. Meya Javadanfar, who is lecturer and analyst on the Middle East. Welcome to both of you. Professor Walsh, may I begin with you? What do you make of the latest move? How far is it from eventually closing the Guantanamo Bay facilities promised by President Obama when he came into the office?
Well, I have two different reactions. First, this is the largest transfer, I believe, on record. So clearly, the administration continues to work very hard to get people out of Guantanamo with a goal of shutting it down. You know, that was a lot of people to transfer at one time. On the other hand, I think most analysts who look at this and look at the pace of transfer over the course of 8 years are skeptical, doubtful whether this is a job that's going to be completed by the time a new president takes office. So I think President Obama is going to do everything he can to get that number as low as possible, but he's racing against the clock right now, and the clock does not favor him.
Mr. Javadanfar, you are having more optimistic or pessimistic views compared to what Professor Walsh just said?
Well, I think Professor Walsh is correct. You know, we have to be realistic about this. First of all, President Obama has to worry about his legacy. You know, the number, he can't just release all of the prisoners at once. They have to be vetted. Right now we see an increase in the number of terror attacks in Europe and in the Middle East, and although It's mostly ISIS now. He has to be very careful that anyone who is going to be released now is not going to be re-engaged in terrorist attacks, because if something happens, then he will, it will affect his legacy, and his administration will be blamed. So I think although Mr. Obama would like ideally to close the Guantanamo Bay, but this is a very sensitive process, and it's going to take a while.
It is a sensitive process. However, in the case studies that people have done among a few hundred detainees, there are those that have already been identified as being mistakenly found guilty. So, can the U.S. government do anything to, in a way, bring back the reputation of these gentlemen? And also, what would that mean for the others that are still left in the facility? What would that mean to their fate? Mr. Javad Bhargava, do you think the Arab countries is likely to ask those questions, or they're likely already being muted at this moment, 14 years after?
Look, it really depends what happens to those who are released. The gentlemen who were released in the recent batch, they're from Yemen and Afghanistan. They can't be returned to the country where they came from, because we know that both countries, their economy is right now in dire straits. There's a lot of insecurity there, and if they actually are transferred back to those countries, the chances that they may be recruited again by terrorist organization may be higher. So it really depends now that what happens when they arrive in the United Arab Emirates, in their new host country. If they are rehabilitated, if they go back to their normal lives and this program is successful, then I think, yes, that's going to have a very positive impact.
Professor Walsh, I'm not sure whether Mr. Javad Bhargava really answered my question, but let me ask you the same question, which is, there have been cases, it could be sporadic, but there are cases in which the gentlemen that have been, in a way, enclosed in the Guantanamo Bay have been found not necessarily guilty as previously accused. They're innocent. So, what would they be, how would they be treated with this after they're being released to, let's just say, United Arab Emirates? And does the U.S. government owe them an apology, or at least a restore of reputation? After all, these young men's life could be ruined by the 14 years in the Guantanamo Bay if they're not guilty.
Yeah, and I would expect that some of them are not guilty, given sort of the helter-skelter way in which people were scooped up and taken there. But I think if you look at criminal justice systems, just normal criminal justice systems, right? The whole Guantanamo process is not the normal judicial process in the United States. But if you look at just normal judicial processes, whether it's China or the U.S. or even Europe and elsewhere, if people are wrongly convicted, it's not often that therefore then the state comes out and issues apologies and makes all their lives better. Unfortunately, and I think this is unfortunate, if someone is found to be wrongfully accused and released, they simply are released back into society. I think we should do more than that, but that is sort of standard practice. So if that's standard practice in a normal judicial system, then I sure as heck don't think it's going to happen with Guantanamo, which was really more of a military judicial system. And frankly, given that this is a political battle domestically in the U.S., I don't think any politician is going to want to be calling a lot of attention to this either way. Now, again, if this was simple domestic law, those folks who were released, who were wrongly convicted, would have avenue to the U.S. courts, and they could sue the state or sue others for wrongful conviction and try to be compensated. But that's not going to happen in this case. I don't think they'll have standing in U.S. courts. So it is unfortunate, but that's sort of the world we're living in right now.
You've got cases on both sides. One is those that might be very innocent and eventually being identified as innocent and also mistakenly accused. But you also got other examples. For example, what has happened to some of the prisoners who were previously released probably could also tell somewhat about what they were before the detention. Figures from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence show Take a look at this. Of the inmates released under George W. Bush, 21% were confirmed to have re-engaged in militant activity, while 14% have been suspected of doing so. Of the release under President Obama, only 5% have been confirmed to have re-engaged in militant activity and 8% suspected of doing so. We cannot tell as to why the number could be so different from one another, but it is legitimate to ask Mr. Jayawardenepur, what's going to happen to these people once they are being released? How much promises have the host countries, not their home countries, but the host countries, have promised to the United States? Or the U.S. just simply export all the problems to these ally countries, that's it. Whatever has happened to them doesn't matter. Mr. Jayawardenepur?
I think see, a lot of these countries where the former inmates are being a lot of these countries where the former inmates are being settled in are actually U.S. allies. For example, let's take the example of United Arab Emirates, a very important country for the United States in the region, strategically and also economically. So we can assume that before they are transferred there have been extensive talks, extensive agreements between the United States and the United Arab Emirates authorities, so that once they are there, the rehabilitation program makes sure that these people don't re-engage in terrorism again, which could explain why the numbers have been low under President Obama. But, you know, one other question we could ask is, why is it that under President Bush, as you stated, 21% of those who were released re-engaged in terrorism and 14% are suspected, which is much higher than the figures of the inmates released under President Obama. And the reason for that could be, number one, maybe the previous rehabilitation programs did not work as well, or number two, those who were released in earlier batches were far more, had a more extensive background in terrorism than those who were released afterwards during President Obama.
That's very interesting an explanation over there, but certainly meaningful. Come back to you, Professor Walsh. Under what circumstances do you think this kind of agreement could be done between the United States and its Arab allies? The UAE, of course, its relations with the U.S. has been very controversial. So was that with some of the other countries such as Saudi Arabia. And there were previous cases in which the countries do not necessarily see eye to eye with the United States on many important issues. So under what circumstances do you think these countries could be willing to host these earlier detainees? And under what circumstances do you think these countries, their political system, will allow them to provide certain kinds of quote-unquote fair treatment to these people?
Well, on the first question, how do these deals get done? Sure, you know, the U.S. Has lots of friends where we agree on some issues and disagree on others, and UAE is certainly an example of that. And these other disagreements, though, don't prevent cooperation on areas of common agreement, and this would be an area of common agreement. It's not in UAE's or any of the U.S.'s Arab governmental friends in the Middle East to have Guantanamo, which only stokes anti-American feeling and becomes a talking point anytime those countries are cooperating with the United States, for example, in the area of security. So UAE, I'm sure, wants to see this go away. The U.S. wants to see it go away. This is a relatively small cost for UAE to help out in this, and it may be that as part of this bargain, the U.S. is helping the UAE with some of its problems that it needs the U.S. for. So that's sort of normal politics in the international system. Let me add, though, parenthetically, that it may be part of the difference in those rates of recidivism for the different presidencies may also be a function of age and sort of physical and cognitive, you know, declines. You know, some of those folks, you know, when they're released, it's 15 years on, and they've been spending time in under very difficult physical and mental circumstances. So as people age and as they have physical infirmities, it's probably less likely they're going to re-engage in violent extremism.
All right. One of the most important points about this is really the domestic political fight going on in Washington. Of course, Obama administration coming into the office promising to close Guantanamo Bay at this moment, very unlikely, as both of you mentioned. And yet, the Republicans have been arguing in the Capitol Hill that there should not be any release of those suspects from the Guantanamo Bay due to national security reasons. So the thing is, Mr. Jayavardenfar, are we going to see President Obama further kick the can down the road and pass the torch to the next president, whoever it might be, Republican or Democrat, about this issue? And how much of a hot potato would this issue be for the next one?
Well, to be quite honest with you, I don't think President Obama wants to kick the can. I think President Obama, in an ideal world, would like all of Guantanamo Bay detention center closed and locked, and with a picture of him standing in front of the doors of the Guantanamo Bay detention center being closed forever. That would be the ideal situation. But President Obama is not going to get that because, you know, number one, as we said, the security considerations, you can't release all the 61 people who are there. And number two, let's not forget, you know, in America there's bipartisan politics. Democrats and the Republicans don't get on, and especially now that President Obama is on his way out, I don't think his Republican competitors will want to give him the satisfaction of you know, his legacy closing down Guantanamo Bay. I think the way democracy goes in many countries, they're competing forces. So I think that is also going to hamper President Obama's efforts to close down Guantanamo Bay. And I think any other president, had he been a Republican president and wanted to do the same, it's very probable that the Democrats would do the same to him. Because in America, you know, it's also, let's not forget, there's a lot of, both sides like to veto each other. Some people say America's turned from democracy to vetocracy. So there is a lot of domestic constraints on the way of President Obama to fulfill his ambition of closing down Guantanamo Bay.
Before we go, Professor Walsh, 30 seconds for you. Who's going to take that can? And who is going to boil that hot potato once again? The next president?
Well, if you look at the most election models, it's not a done deal, but it's certainly more likely than unlikely that Hillary Clinton will be elected president. And I think this is just a sort of issue that's going to, they'll keep working at it. And let's face it, some people are just going to grow old and die, and it will self-resolve over time, unfortunately. But I think this is just slow and steady progress over time. Now, and it's not really a campaign issue in the election. I think America is not focused on this. But if Mr. Trump were to win and he were to expand it, that would make it an issue again. So that would change it from something that's really not a priority, not a political football today, more quiet, at least relative to other issues, and that would infuse it with new you know, political juice, and so it would become a new issue, I think, under a President Trump.
Jim Walsh, Mayor Jayavardenfar, thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of a program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You'll be able to find us, or you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.